So, good evening, everyone. As I think most of you know, I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this evening's MarketingKind xChange, in which we'll be exploring how purposeful enterprise can prevail in turbulent times. We could hardly be in better company to do so, because we are joined this evening by one of the most proven leaders of purpose-driven enterprise in the world, David Boynton. David was, of course, until recently global CEO of The Body Shop, where he led triple bottom line growth across more than 75 countries. Before that, he was CEO of the brilliant but almost impossible to pronounce menswear company Charles Tewit. And before that, he was part of a small leadership team that grew the French beauty business L'Occitane from revenues of around 200 million euros a year to over 1.2 billion euros a year. David is also no stranger to leading in turbulent times, having taken over at The Body Shop after what had widely been regarded as a very difficult period for the business under the ownership of the French cosmetics giant L'Oreal. And then, of course, having led a purpose-driven revival of the business under the ownership of the Brazilian B Corp Natura, had to contend with the global health emergency of the pandemic, ultimately leading to the lockdown of over 90% of The Body Shop's retail outlets. And then following that, of course, operating in a polycrisis environment impacted by international conflict, a high level of inflation, high cost of borrowing, perhaps most impactful of all for retail, a cost of living crisis. So this evening's conversation will be part exit interview, reflecting back on David's period leading The Body Shop, and partly also a forward-looking appraisal of the opportunities for purpose-driven enterprise that we might all seek to embrace in today's complex macro environment, if we believe that an effective approach to purpose is a necessary route to success in difficult times, and not just some kind of nice to have for when the sun is shining. So welcome to MarketingKind, David. How are you this evening?
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. I'm delighted to be with you and the whole gathering. So I'm excited to share some of the learning of what it's been like being at the helm of The Body Shop over the last 5.5 years or so.
Wonderful. So our plan for the conversation, as typical with our exchanges, is I have a number of questions to explore with David, looking at different periods of turbulence and how he has led work to contend with that turbulence. And then we'll open up for questions and group discussion from approximately 5:45, closing for 6:15. So, David, I wanted to start by going right back to when you took over at The Body Shop in, I believe, 2017. And I wonder if at the start of that process, really the challenge was a sort of internal turbulence. And I wonder to what degree it would be fair to say that the business just wasn't at that point good enough, perhaps in either sense of the word good. On the one hand, long-term diehard fans of The Body Shop may not have perceived L'Oreal as being quite the right platform for developing an activist brand. And then on the other hand, L'Oreal, the most successful beauty business in the world. As it happens, I began my career in global brand development in L'Oreal, and L'Oreal is not known for selling businesses. It grows its own brands, it acquires businesses and brands where it sees opportunities to exploit them across its global markets, but doesn't have a business model built around exiting businesses. So in a sense, people working in The Body Shop may have perceived the L'Oreal exit as somewhat of a rejection from the world's most successful beauty business. So can you bring to life for us the nature of some of the internal problems in The Body Shop as a business when you first arrived?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's a really great point that you're making, Paul. And look, I just think it would be helpful to maybe turn the clock back a little bit further to the acquisition by L'Oreal, just to give a little bit of context and understanding of of the journey that the business had over the 10 years that it was part of that group. So Anita Ruddock, and Gordon Ruddock obviously were running the business, as I think everybody knows pretty well. There were significant shareholders in the Body Shop, which was a public company. And they brought in a professional management team to help them round about the turn of the millennium. A little earlier than that, a couple of gentlemen called Adrian Bellamy and Peter Saunders, who were well versed in professional operation of businesses, and in the case of Peter in particular, had run significant retail businesses. And their mission really was to get the business ready for sale, because the Ruddocks were pretty exhausted. They'd been running the business obviously since 1976. It had been a bumpy ride. They'd taken the company public quite early on in its life. I think they regretted that later on when they saw what Yvon Chouinard had done at Patagonia and others. But that was the path that they took, and they were keen to get out. And I think for the business and the people in the business, Anita leaving and the sale to L'Oreal was kind of like a bereavement. It was a business that was kind of losing its mother. And tragically, Anita died only a year after the sale to L'Oreal, and that made it doubly hard. And I think it's important looking at L'Oreal, and you're an ex-alumnus. It's a fantastic business, right? I mean, they do what they do remarkably well. It's the most successful beauty company in the world by far, and it just seems to go from strength to strength. So, going into that organization, there's no doubt in my mind from everything that I saw, the L'Oreal management really wanted the Body Shop project to work. So they put a lot of money into it. They put some of their really best executives into the company, and relaunched the brand multiple times. But I think there was, this fundamental challenge around the Body Shop is quirky, it's British. It was famous for having a slightly unusual point of view and sense of humor. It was very activist, which is not something that played well within the L'Oreal context. And I think L'Oreal just found it incredibly difficult to integrate all of those things and be true to that past history of what the brand represented as part of their portfolio of brands. It was just so different. And the fact that it was retail as well, of course, that's not L'Oreal's passion. L'Oreal's interest generally ends when the product arrives at Boots or Superdrug's warehouse, to then be transported onto somebody else's stores. So that was something that was new for them. And I think, despite the fact that there were brilliant people involved in it, I just think they really found it hard to make sense of all of that. So after 10 years, to your point, they made the very unusual decision that they were going to sell the business. That so rarely happens. And of course, Natura was the successful acquirer. And to your point around the cultural impact and damage, look, there was a narrative that I used a lot to help people to understand what was going on. It was, the business really felt like an orphan, being orphaned and lost its mother, initially just commercially, and then in reality, Anita sadly passed away. And there was a stepfather, and the stepfather loved the child and wanted the child to do well and was invested in its success, but couldn't help but notice that this child was a bit different from his other children and somehow didn't quite make it work. And then in the end, the stepfather gave up as well. So you kind of lost the mother and the stepfather in a period of 10 years. And the people in the organization were badly bruised by that. I think the thing that I found that was most interesting and surprising, having been in a business like L'Occitane, which might be surprising to the folks on the call, is a really entrepreneurial business, right? It's really can do. There's a lot of drive. The people are very passionate, and the people take risks. I mean, you don't go from 200 million to north of $1 billion without real drive, ambition, and risk taking. The entrepreneurial culture was very strong in that business, and it was completely absent in the Body Shop, and that was amazing for me, bearing in mind that Anita had been this iconic, highly successful entrepreneur. But I think a lot of it came down to confidence. People were bruised. People had become risk averse. There was this double rejection that had happened over the course of 10 years, and there was very much a case of people waiting to see what would happen and not being prepared to lean in and take chances and move the game on. And that was, it meant that the business wasn't innovating, it wasn't doing new things, and it was losing ground to the competition. So that's kind of the landscape, particularly from a cultural point of view, that I walked in at the back end of 2017. And it was a surprise. It's really not what I thought I would be encountering in, one of the businesses, a business that was founded by one of the most famous entrepreneurs in British business history.
And actually, I wanted to ask about that. I mean, you talk about the surprise when you arrived. To what degree were Natura? Because I imagine, Natura, they must have seen something in the situation. They must have seen a hidden potential to develop that L'Oreal just wasn't quite managing to bring about. So, to what degree did Natura have a sort of turnaround thesis to share with you, or were you the turnaround thesis?
Yeah, I mean, look, clearly you make an acquisition of the thick end of $1 billion US, you have a plan. Nobody's going to lend you that kind of money unless there's some kind of plan that makes sense. So clearly there was a plan of, the classic, people on this call will be very familiar with what it looks like, 5 pillars of things that you needed to do around cost out, around, enhancing omni-channel operations, all of that good stuff. But it wasn't a massive amount of detail. It was kind of the headlines. And look, I think the real rationale for Natura stepping in was Natura. I mean, maybe it's just worthwhile taking a couple of minutes to talk a bit about Natura Cosmeticos for the audience, because not everybody will be so familiar with it. It's an absolutely gorgeous business, more than 50 years old, a B Corp, I think the biggest B Corp in the world, actually. Does amazing work with communities in the Amazon and has done for decades. Their factories are these amazing eco parks. You've never seen anything like it, where they've invested so much time and love and care in, in reinstating the nature around the factories and making sure that the biome is respected in Brazil. The biomes are all so distinctive. And it's an incredibly impressive company. And when the Body Shop first joined and we went down there as a leadership group, it was like being, going to a warm embrace. It's Latin, it's Brazil, people are very passionate, very smiley. It was a really beautiful moment. And it was a moment that the Body Shop needed because of this damage that had been done to its confidence. So that was all terrific. But I think that the real rationale at that time for why Natura thought Body Shop would be a good addition was Natura is really, really incredibly famous in Latin America. It's a market leader in pretty much every market where it operates in Latin America, but it's not really known outside. There was a small presence in the US, a very small presence in France. And I think the idea was that the global distribution of the Body Shop would provide a platform that would allow the Natura brand to be able to expand outside of Latin America. So I think, in terms of where management was seeing the value at the time of acquisition, I think that was the biggest single thing.
And so they had broader strategic vision of what it could mean for the business. But of course, you had to take over at the Body Shop. You're leading a group of people who have been orphaned, then rejected. What is sort of the early priorities for an incoming global CEO in that situation, and how did you start to rekindle a sense of mission or build the confidence of the people that you were leading, so to feel that they could actually sort of become their own versions of Anita Roddick for a new era?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting time. And as I say, I walked into a scenario that was quite different from what I expected. I didn't realize the scale of change that was needed. And, at a somewhat sort of, basic, business operational point of view, although I say basic, but very significant, I joined just after Black Friday and Cyber Monday, which is, clearly one of the big commercial peaks of the year for a retail business. And the website had crashed and been down for 4 days during the busiest time of the year. So the website didn't work. We had difficulty getting inventory into stores. Our ERP system was not supported by SAP anymore. So there was all of that stuff, the mechanics of the business that needed to be addressed. But I think the thing that was most interesting for me was that, one of the choices that had been made in the later years of L'Oreal's ownership was that Anita Roddick had kind of been airbrushed out of the history of the company. And I think, it's interesting because it is important for businesses to look forward and to innovate and to be relevant for the current generation. And there's been some criticism of the Body Shop recently in the media that it wasn't doing enough of that. But Anita was a remarkable person. Anita changed the cosmetics industry globally forever. To not honor her or not have her at least as a guiding light within the business felt like an enormous miss. So I think that the first approach for me was to kind of say, Anita isn't around anymore. I can't even pick up the phone and talk to her. I did speak to Gordon on a couple of occasions, who's a fantastic individual, but he was out. He didn't want to be back in the business. So we had to kind of get ourselves in a situation of being able to answer the question: if Anita was around today, what would she do, and what would what's the reason that the Body Shop would be trading? Why are we here, and why do we deserve to exist in 2017 as we did back in 1976? So the first piece of work that I did, aside from all the sort of the machinery stuff that needed to be done and hiring great people to be able to take care of all of that, was let's answer that question about what Anita would do today. And we did a ton of work around bottoming out a purpose statement that at least enabled us to make better choices about how the business should go forward. That we could get much clearer on being able to say it's this and not this, whether it's our employment strategy, what we pay our people in stores, the supply chain decisions that we have to make, formulations of our products, all of that stuff being guided by a clearer sense of purpose.
So maybe could you talk us through that purpose statement and the process of pulling it together, and maybe give us a sense of some of the early wins that came with it, and we'll move on to how that matured over the subsequent years.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned earlier the fantastic unpronounceable menswear business Charles Tyrwhitt, and just a quick word, it is Tyrwhitt, by the way, and that's so that nobody will ever forget this. It's the plaintive cry of the lapwing. And the lapwing has a particular significance to Nick Wheeler's family. So the Tyrwhitt is its cry. Tyrwhitt is the lapwing. So you'll never forget that now. So while I was at Charles Tyrwhitt, I connected with a remarkable woman called Dilys Maltby, who runs an agency called Circus London. And I was getting her to come into Tyrwhitt to do a little bit of work funnily enough, on purpose there as well. And we'd read the news that the Body Shop was up for sale, and Dilys mentioned that she'd been a former marketing director of the Body Shop during Anita's time, obviously working in L'Occitane and having grown up in the 80s. I was a massive fan of the business as well. So we just kind of connected and kind of reminisced on the good old days and wrung our hands at the difficulties the business was facing. So when I got into the Body Shop, I asked Dilys to come and help. So she came on board, and we worked for about 5 months with a group of about 100 people, largely inside the business, but also people who'd been important stakeholders in the history of the Body Shop in the past, and just sort of bottomed out, when it was good, why was it good? What was special and unique about it? What are those things that are relevant that we can make work for us today? And not all of them were easy to do, right? Because if you think about the Body Shop in its golden era, I think there's a new golden era ahead, by the way. But the time when it was really setting the standard, the big thing was that it was against the establishment. Whatever the establishment was, the Body Shop was the opposite. And if somebody was zigging, we would be zagging. That was the thing. It was counterculture, right? And it was deeply rooted in, Anita and Gordon were hippies in the late 1960s, right? And so that sort of hippie culture, and as it evolved into the 70s, was really at the heart of their thinking. The challenge is today, what is the establishment? Does anybody actually know? It's so diffuse and so complex, for all the reasons that everyone will have, no doubt be aware and reflect on daily. So it's quite difficult to get that sort of, counter view. So we said, okay, we're going to focus on how we can be positive and make a positive difference. And the statement that we landed at was that the Body Shop fights for a fairer, more beautiful world. That's our purpose. Fight is about, we're not passive, we're active, we get involved, we want to make change happen. It honors the spirit of activism that Anita brought. Fairer, big deal around social justice, which has always been at the heart of the business, whether that's justice for the people who work in our stores, whether it's in our communities, or whether it's people who are disenfranchised around the world, at least shining a light on some of those issues. And then beautiful world was, every dimension of the word beauty, frankly, and it wasn't the classical sense of what you see in the mirror in the morning. Of course, that's part of it because it is about selling cosmetics products that people enjoy using. But it's also about, the beauty of the planet, the beauty of human relations, just the fact that we live in the most amazing planet in the universe that I'm aware of. So let's celebrate that fact. So that was the sort of the high level purpose statement that guided us. And then there was, you can imagine there was a ton of work that was done behind the scenes. We spent 5 months on this. So there was, what does that mean for product? What does it mean for people? What does it mean for our suppliers? What does it mean for every choice that we make in the business? And that was kind of documented in a kind of how-to book that then, was then at the heart of every subsequent decision that managers and leaders through the business were able to make. I don't know if that answered your question. Probably, I probably danced around it a bit.
We're going to get shortly to the global pandemic that followed, but just before we do, over that period from 2017 almost to 2020, for somebody who walked into a body shop, or for somebody who maybe periodically was in a body shop over the course of a calendar year, how would that purpose statement of fighting for a fairer, more beautiful world have been tangible to them? Yeah,
exactly. And it's a great question. So look, I had a, maybe wrongly, but it's my belief. I had a belief that the purpose statement should kind of be like Fight Club. It's like, key thing about Fight Club is there is no Fight Club. So we're never going to talk about purpose, but it's going to be in there inside us, helping us to make better decisions. But it's not going to mean that we send emails out to our customers saying, because we fight for a fairer, more beautiful world, we're doing this, we're doing that. It needed to be implicit. It couldn't be, crude, explicit statements. It needed to be much more internal and something that we passionately held on to as a team. So, in the first couple of years, the thing about the beauty industry, and I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with it, but things like new products take time. Typically, from first conception to delivery onto a shelf is about 2 years. Store design and store concepts can be a little bit quicker than that. Culture change can sometimes happen a little bit quicker than that, at least at a superficial level. So the kind of things that we were doing in those early days, and one of the first decisions that we made was saying, how do we bring purpose to life for our people so that they can bring it to life for our customers? And there was a big investment in 2 populations right at the start. One was the immediate leadership team that was reporting into me, who obviously had to be mobilized behind this and understanding what it meant for the decisions that they were making. But the other group that was incredibly important was our store manager population. We made the decision to not cascade purpose-driven leadership right the way through the business from the top. We did it at the top, and then we did it from the bottom and really focused on our store managers and the people who are leading stores and the people who are bringing the brand to life for customers every day. So there was a big investment made, because you can imagine that's one of the biggest management populations you have in any retail business. For them to go on a 2-day workshop and explore, their own purpose and what it meant for them to be an authentic leader and how they could be impactful and how they would, lead their teams to find their own sense of purpose and bring the story of the Body Shop to life. So, that was a big change that I think we saw in certainly the second half of 2018. And then in 2019, the store design started to evolve and change. And we, begged our owners to let us have some capital so that we could roll that out in key markets and key locations around the world. And we started to take a different approach to our messaging. In the later days of L'Oreal, if you got an email from the Body Shop, you basically saw 50% off today, except on the days when it was 40% off or 60% off, but it was always something percent off. And we changed the dialogue so that we were talking about honoring the people that are in our ethical supply chains, the people who bring the incredible ingredients to our products, some of the decisions that we were making, just as a for instance, to support a fledgling organization, you probably know it pretty well, called Plastics for Change, which was in India, in Bengaluru. And they were just starting out. They didn't have a customer. We were the first customer. And this was about a social impact program that was about collecting waste plastic from the streets of Bengaluru and making sure that the waste pickers got a fair price, got an identity card that enabled them to be acknowledged and not harassed by the police for stealing, and all of the things that they had to contend with, and gave them a consistent, predictable price so that they could budget and plan their household expenses accordingly. And these are some of the people who are amongst the most deprived in India, right? So this was a program where we said, we're going to use post-consumer plastic content in our product, but we don't just want to be doing what everybody else is doing. We want to do it in a way that has social impact. And that's why we were the first partner of Plastics for Change. So that started to, that was launched in 2019, and that started to gather momentum as our purchase built through the course of that year. So I think the key thing is, Paul, to your point, at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, we'd done a lot of the thinking, we'd started a lot of things, but we were very much a work in progress.
I did a mystery shop in a local body shop a few weeks ago in anticipation of our conversation, and the Plastics for Change initiative was clearly explained and introduced on the back left wall. Entering the shop, all of the semiotics, the visual codes were high foregrounding environmentalism and sustainability. To the left was a sort of refill station where people could bring in their empty products and refill them rather than have to buy a whole load of new packaging. The staff were friendly and willing to engage on the ethical issues with partial confidence, I would say. And there was a very nice presentation of Plastics for Change, and also an opportunity to get involved in a campaign to extend the vote to younger people from age of 16, as young people are so affected by so many of today's issues. So a lot of what you're talking about is clearly still manifesting and driving in the business. I want to take a dive into a second period of turbulence, but that was not self-inflicted. So of course, 2020 and the arrival of the pandemic, a retail business, 90% of the retail premises go into lockdown, a pivot to online sales. And of course, for many people, you think of switching to online and you're moving away from an experiential, physical environment where you can influence people with purpose. And many people might think that online purchase is just about how cheap can I get it, how quick can I get it, and so might be a challenge to purpose. I suppose the health emergency also made us think again about what beauty means. I mean, was it beauty in the sense of the people weren't going out, so was it more of a switch to self-care rather than beauty in a conventional sense? And of course you had a workforce who were also maybe their confidence is coming back, and then they're having to work from home, and it's much less easy to be sure of the state of confidence of your workforce and if people are falling through the cracks. So how did the work or the purposeful revival fare under the conditions of the pandemic, and to what degree did purpose, as we have been talking about it, play a role in helping you through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really fantastic framing of the situation, Paul. And look, I think the advantage that we had, we'd had that the leadership team had 2 years of working incredibly closely together, addressing all of these existential challenges that we had to embark on, and really understanding what it meant to be purpose-led, right? Because it's very easy to have a purpose statement. It's very easy to put it on a mouse mat, to put it on a commemorative mug, to make it the screensaver for everybody in the organization. HR can just press a button and all of a sudden everybody goes into work and sees we're here to fight for a fairer, more beautiful world. which of course doesn't change anything, but it just makes people feel like they've done something. So, we had done a huge amount of work to embed this into the business and give people a sense of hope and confidence, and the sense that, the Body Shop was an important business that was here to do something more than just sell soap. I think all of that stuff helped us come together as a team during difficult times. I mean, I'm sure everybody on the call will have amazing stories about how their company rose to the challenge, because I know it was a common theme, right? We can't do this, so let's do that, and let's make ourselves useful, and let's make sure our business survives to the end of this. So everybody was driven by by the existential threat that the pandemic represented. But we came through it better than most, frankly. We did pivot well to online. We had a very small direct selling business that became very important for the next 2 years of, folks who were at home, who had time on their hands, who were interested in beauty, and heard the message of what the Body Shop was about, and it resonated for them. And I think this point that you're making around self-care was incredibly important. People needed treats, people needed something to look forward to. And there's no question that the whole digital landscape did incredibly well during those 2 years, but especially in 2020. I think, what we were able to do with the sense of purpose was work really hard at staying connected to our store folks who were stuck at home, and making sure that there was a big effort around regular communication, regular gatherings, checking in with people. If people weren't on calls, understanding why they weren't on calls and if they were okay, and how we could lean in to support them. And I think there've been 2 years of laying the groundwork that enabled us to be able to navigate that remarkably well. It was painful, it was exhausting. Everyone on the call who's been a leader will know that it certainly by the first quarter of 2022, it felt like you'd been walking with an enormous weight on your shoulder forever, frankly. And there's no question that it took a toll on leaders right the way through the business. And we might want to touch on that a little bit as we continue the conversation. But look, I think there was a glue from purpose that bound the organization together and made us feel this was something worth saving. And I think people really lent in and went the extra mile as a consequence of that.
Yeah. And maybe we can dig in, as you say, to the weight on the shoulders of leadership. I was reflecting. I was at a conference looking at purpose-driven technology in Oxford a couple of days ago, and the panelists were reflecting on the fact that 20 years ago, people in technology didn't really want to hear about ethics, not because they were unethical, but because they just wanted to get on with their technology. Whereas today, it was a number one priority is the ethical deployment of the technologies we're advancing. And it struck me that organizations have over recent decades sort of optimized for efficiency, but efficiency doesn't necessarily allow for a great deal of surplus thinking time, and there is just an enormous cognitive load to today's challenges. So as you come out of the pandemic, it has no doubt taken a visible and a less visible toll on leadership and other staff. And then, of course, Putin invades Ukraine. Permacrisis sort of morphs into polycrisis as the word of the era, and we face this sort of quintuple whammy of all of the different macro environmental problems. What kind of turbulence has this polycrisis environment created for a business like the Body Shop, and how do you contend even cognitively as a leader in charge of such a complex global operation with an environment where everything is feeding into everything else in a seemingly irresolvable ways?
Wow, what a question. Look, I think I mean, there's several parts. I'll answer that in several parts. I think personally, as a leader, and certainly with my immediate team as well, I think that there's something incredibly important for us around, this idea. Bill George, I think, was the first one to really popularize this, but this idea of authentic leadership. Really knowing yourself, why you're doing the things that you're doing, and where you draw strength and courage and all the other things that you have to have as a leader from. And quite early on in my life, I've been involved in a program with an organization called Authentic Leadership Institute that's was created by Nick Craig based on Bill George's work. And I felt I got a pretty good sense of why I was on the planet and what I was doing when I was being at my best, frankly. And I drew a lot of strength from that. That's not to say that it wasn't exhausting. That wasn't to say that, there were moments when you thought, really, I'm done, right? I can't. I think the biggest challenge was not the amount of work and the sort of the cognitive inputs that were required at that time, because clearly this wasn't my first rodeo. I'd seen a lot of this stuff before, and there's the pattern recognition element, which is important. And as Hahnemann likes to talk about system 1 and system 2 thinking, I think you have the experience to be able to operate really quite effectively in a system 1 place, which takes a lot less effort, right, than when you're struggling with system 2 problems. So, but I think the thing that was hard, even in all of that context, was the uncertainty of the future landscape. This sort of belief that things will get better at some point, and you have that strong belief as I think as an authentic leader, but when? Is it next month, next quarter, next year? And I think the thing that was really hard, I observed for the leaders in my group as well as myself, was this sense of when the hell are we going to get out of this? Because we've been hearing stuff around V-shaped recoveries, U-shaped recoveries, swoosh-shaped recoveries, no recovery whatsoever, right? And which one is it going to be? And that sense of optimism and hope that things will improve, I think really took its toll on people, particularly by the time the invasion of Ukraine happened and the fallout of all of that. I think that happened at the end of leaders really being under tremendous pressure for 2 years, and I think that was tough, in terms of people finding the resources and having the network around them to give them the strength to be able to find a way through that. So that was at a sort of personal level. I think at a business level, something that we haven't touched on, but it's quite important for this phase of the Body Shop, because I think it would be a shame, and I'm not saying this out of any sense of ego, by the way, but because I am extremely proud of the work that we've done with the brand. But it's been quite well reported, particularly in the British media, that Natura is selling the business because the business isn't doing well. And there's no question that after 4.5 years of doing pretty well, the last year was quite tough. And I think, when you see the news that's been broadcast today, there's been quite a bit of coverage about the sale of the company to private equity. There's a bigger context to that. So if you observe what's been happening in Natura over the last year or so, obviously there's been the sale of ESOP, which was a trophy asset, very much loved within the Natura group. And that was sold to L'Oreal for 2.5 billion. And obviously the sale has just happened for the Body Shop. And I think it's really a case of, what becomes incredibly important in this kind of situation is an alignment of, all the stakeholders in this situation. And I think that for all the work that the team at the Body Shop did, that I think is extremely interesting and sets the business up into, on a very good footing for its next round of ownership, the board of Natura wanted to go in a different direction. And when that happens, there's no discussion around it. The choice was to say, we want to focus on direct selling. From everything that I've read in the media, particularly today, we want to focus on direct selling, and we would prefer to have our main focus as Latin America. And the Body Shop clearly doesn't fit within that context. So this change has happened, and it's entering a new era. And it's kind of strange to see a beauty brand being passed around in the way that this amazing company has been over the last few years. But I think if Natura don't want to own the body shop and it doesn't fit their strategy, then it's probably better that it is with a business that does buy into the proposition of the body shop and is committed to it and wants to see it succeed in the future. So I'm sure that the events that we've read about today are a healthy thing.
Yeah, it feels like Natura, in a sense, often a dilemma for leadership in a downturn is, when do you engage in long-term investment? Because I suppose evidence shows that long-term investment tends to outperform short-term investment, and also long-term investment in a downturn seems to be particularly good for placing businesses in the right place, in the right way, and having the right stance for when when there is a resurgence. And it does feel as if, from the outside and from my freer perspective as somebody less connected, that it feels like there's an element of their retrenchment and sticking to their original core. But I wonder, so much of this, because obviously you've led businesses on very fast growth tracks, you've led businesses in some of the most difficult to operate in environments. To what degree does today's macro environment require us to rethink what success means some of the time, and to know that maybe we need to give ourselves permission to be thinking, well, survival might be success today, keeping people's morale in a safe place might be what success means today. And I just wonder, looking back on your time before we look at your future portfolio interests, what is the change that you're proudest of bringing to the body shop? And also the experience of leading such an iconic business since 2017. How has that changed you as a leader, as a person, having that opportunity to cultivate that kind of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, look, many sources of pride. I mean, look, I had largely been in high growth business environments in the past. Usually there'd been some degree of turnaround. There'd be some part of the world wasn't working very well and we needed to go in and fix it. But to have the opportunity as a leader to go into a business that had totally lost its confidence, that was one of the most important game-changing brands in the industry, and to be pretty much given a blank canvas to say, what should this brand look like for the 2020s and beyond? It was the biggest thrill of my professional career, Paul. You can imagine, right? And I think there's so many things that the team, the remarkable people that were in the business, so many things that they have done that are brilliant, that sets the company up well for the future. And I think, most of all, it's a sense of pride, a sense of direction, a sense of, the body shop isn't this tired and dusty relic of the past. It's not Yardley. It's not Bronley, or no disrespect to those two well-respected English soap companies, who I'm sure are still going. But the body shop is vital, relevant, influential even today. People are interested and want to know what the body shop is doing. And I think, to a greater or lesser extent, notwithstanding the fact that it's been pretty painful for everybody in the business over the last 9 months, with the change that's been brewing and now happened. I think giving it its mojo back through rediscovering its sense of purpose, I think was really the thing that I'd be proudest of. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? You asked such good, complex questions that it's.
I apologize for the complexity of them, but Buckminster Fuller said, if you want to change somebody's thinking, don't ask them to change how they think. Give them a tool, the use of which brings a new pattern of thinking with it. And my question a little bit, the second part was, how do you feel that, having had that experience of since 2017, how has that changed you as a leader, having such a purposeful opportunity to pursue and further building on those particular set of leadership muscles?
Yeah, I mean, that is extremely interesting. And I think, look, when you go in as a leader into an organization, any organization, but particularly a big and complex one, everyone's looking at you, right? Everyone wants to know, does this guy really mean it? Do the words and music actually match He's saying one thing, is he doing something else? And there's this constant sense of judgment around all of that. And navigating all of that, staying on track, taking the organization with you requires an enormous amount of internal energy and confidence, right? There are 10,000 people looking at you saying, we expect this guy to have the answer. And we'd be very disappointed if he doesn't. So I think having gone through, as a leader in a company like L'Occitane en Provence, in a company like Charles Tyrwhitt and other businesses where I've worked in Asia with Watson's, I've done interesting things, but nothing on this scale. And I think the thing that equips you to be able to take on future challenges is knowing that you can come through something like this and have learned a lot about your resilience, a lot about what's worked, a lot about what hasn't worked. And I think it gives you an enormous sense of confidence about what you can do next. And certainly that's what I'd be taking away, because I think going into the Body Shop for me, never having done something on this scale and this level of complexity and being surprised at level of complexity, I've been doing a lot of this stuff for the first time. It's been theoretical prior to this, but it's gone from being theory to practice. And I think, the learning journey of 5.5 years was the richest that I've ever had as an executive and as a human being, frankly. And I'm a different person now from the person that went in. I probably humbler. I've always been a humble person. I hope that comes across. But I know myself better. I know where my strengths are even better than I did before. And I think I have the steel at the heart of me is tempered, stronger, more resilient, and it will stand me in good stead for what happens next. So it's been fascinating.
It's an interesting coincidence. Our last exchange was with the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, and he has been Mayor of Manchester since approximately when you became CEO of the Body Shop, and I met him before that when he was a Westminster politician, and it was clear that period had an effect on him that is not really dissimilar in many ways as a pattern to the effect on you of leading at the Body Shop. And certainly in his case, he brought to life how, as a Westminster politician, he could think in silos of one department versus another, whereas as a mayor was able to take a much more holistic view on life, solving tackling problems like long-term health-related unemployment with interventions that dealt with somebody's health and their employment prospects at the same time. And so It's really interesting to see how we don't just change the things that we lead, but we are also very much changed by them as well. I'm gonna invite people to put their own questions to you shortly, although I have plenty more, particularly with everything that you've been saying to us. But just before, while people put their questions, identify their questions, you talked about the confidence that you now have moving forwards after the Body Shop. What are the sort of portfolio interests that you're turning to, and what advice do you have for us on the nature of the opportunities for purposeful enterprise that we should be getting most excited about, for example, amongst our community at MarketingKind in today's environment?
Yeah, I think, look, in terms of my portfolio interest that they're building, I've just committed. I can't say because they're doing my social media checks at the moment. So until the social media comes up with a clean bill of health, I can't declare exactly what it is I'm going to be doing. But it's a significant UK charity. It's a pro bono role, but one with real influence and the opportunity to make an impact on a cause that I care very much about. So I'm excited about that. I wish I could say who it was, but I can't right now. I mean, the key thing for me, Paul, honestly, has been I've always had a passion for talent development. There's a number of people that have worked with me over the years who've gone on to do, join me in very junior roles and are now doing huge CEO roles in a number of different businesses in different countries around the world. And, the satisfaction that comes from being able to mentor and support leaders on their development journey is incredibly, rewarding for me. And the kind of projects that I've been looking to add to the portfolio has been around, young entrepreneurs with great ideas, with the drive to make those ideas happen. It's one of the passions of mine, and what I look for in talent is the overriding talent that I seek is drive. Not drive for ego and making yourself look good, but drive to make an important change happen in the performance of a business or whatever. And that's kind of where I'm focusing my energy at the moment. The difficulty is there's lots of discussions going on, so making the decision about which things I'm prepared to commit to, because they're all incredibly time consuming, is a work in progress. And I think by January I'll be much clearer on how a lot of that works. I think one thing that I didn't answer, Paul, and if you forgive me just to take a couple of minutes, because I think it is an important point. You raised the question around what does success look like these days, and does it have different measures? And I think that is incredibly important. And you and I have discussed privately offline about me being at the Conscious Capitalism conference recently in Austin, Texas, which is an organization that was set up by John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods. And John is really passionate on this point. We are in business, we are capitalists. Capitalism is a force for good. The biggest single force that has taken human beings out of poverty has been capitalism. Now, that's not to say unfettered bad capitalism, conscious capitalism, which is obviously the model that John espouses. But success in business is measured on a balanced scorecard, and on that balanced scorecard will be our sales growing, our profits at an acceptable level, our profits growing, in addition to things like, are we making an impact in the societies that we serve? Are we making a positive impact where we possibly can, or at least minimizing the negative impact that we're having on the environment of where the business is operating? But making sure that all of those things are measured. But success ultimately in a business context does have to involve making money, right? And making money is something that's actually quite hard to do. But when you have a business that's viable and healthy and sustainable and can continue, you have the opportunity to touch lots of people's lives, the people inside the company, but also your supply chain, the people who shop with you, and and I think that triple bottom line model, as opposed to the sort of perhaps more traditional American model of philanthropy, where you make a ton of money and then you give it away, that's not the model that the triple bottom line espouses. Of course, it's the way that you make money has a positive impact on the world. But there's no shying away from the fact that we're capitalists, we run businesses, and businesses must make money. So ultimately, success must come down to an acknowledgement of that, even in the most difficult times.
I'll invite anyone to raise their digital hands as they have questions. It looks like we have some already, so I'll hang fire on what I was going to say. So I think, Louise, you were first, and then I'll come to Joseph after Louise.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you very much, David. Very interesting to hear you talk. You mentioned earlier on, I think, that you saw a brighter future ahead for the Body Shop. And I'm just really curious to know what gives you that confidence. I don't mean that to sound challenging. It's a point of curiosity. No. What gives you the sense of hope for the Body Shop? Particularly, I'm curious, given the shift to private equity ownership, which can bring challenges. So yeah, interested to hear kind of what gives you that.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that's been on everybody's mind since it became clear that Natura we're going to sell. Look, there's been two strategic owners, and L'Oreal gave up after 10 years, and Natura has now given up after 6 years. It hasn't worked for a range of reasons, and I think that as I touched on earlier, Natura is a complex business, and it's got some big decisions to make about the kind of business it wants to be in the future. And it means that as it makes those decisions, it can't focus on the Body Shop. So I think, what I take out from this change is Aurelius is going to be all in. on the Body Shop. It's going to be their focus. They're going to need it to succeed. Now, what the journey is going to look like along the way, I mean, who knows? I don't know the parties well enough to comment. But I think the thing that I take encouragement from is there's a lot of things in the Body Shop today that are fundamentally right, and it needs, owners that are well capitalized, that are motivated to apply that capital to the success of the business. And from everything that I'm seeing and hearing about Aurelius, in terms of how they feel about the Body Shop and what they've been saying, it feels like they bring that level of capitalization and focus, which I think ultimately has to be a good thing for the business.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
For everything that I've come across about Aurelius, it would indicate that their long-term patient capital, no fixed exit point in mind. So we're really looking to identify businesses where their investment can optimize a business because there is a viable business there, not sort of financial re-engineering or that kind of approach. So that does seem to make sense. And we also had a comment in the chat from memory earlier from Nicole saying the media in Brazil was essentially covering Natura's exit as being for their own rationale rather than any particular aspect of the Body Shop business itself. I'll come to Joseph, and then after Joseph, Alan.
Good to see you, David. David, I had a question for you in regards to your senior leadership and how you kept them on the purpose journey and the purpose strategy, and just what were some of the challenges you faced along the way, whether it was with the senior leadership or even with your own board.
Yeah, hi Joe, really good to see you. Thanks for the question. So we just spent a lot of time together, and we kept bringing the group together every quarter to just say, are we on the right track, and are we really honoring the sense of purpose that we have? And are the decisions that we made last time we were together still holding true today? And I think, look, you almost certainly would have been through it with your experiences over the last few years. The fight that we've had to fight through over the last few just builds really deep relationships. There was this very strong sense of connection between us as human beings, but also around this idea that we're supporting an important idea and an idea that's making a difference to the world. So, there's been difficult times. The leadership team as it stands today is not the leadership team of a year ago for a variety of reasons. But I think while we were together as a group, I think there were deep ties that bound us together, and this sense of purpose was really what gave us all our collective energy. So yeah, and thanks for your help with your guidance on one of the coolest things that we did in those years of introducing open hiring to retail, and the way we were able to touch so many people's lives, and hopefully we'll continue to do so with the new ownership.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that point came up, actually, because open hiring was in my notes as something we shouldn't overlook. It's such a, I don't know if everyone in the gathering is familiar with the concept, but open hiring, I believe, David, means that anybody who wanted a role in the Body Shop, instead of applying in the conventional say, could just choose to join a waiting list, and when it came to their turn, they would at least get an opportunity to have that role in the Body Shop and to prove themselves rather than having to be selected.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we didn't originate the idea. Joe Kenner and the Grayson Bakery team were the originators, and Bernie Glassman, the founder of Grayson Bakery, was the originator of it in terms of having an impact with unemployment in the community that where he operated the bakery. And we were challenging ourselves to say, how can we think differently about economic inclusion? And we've always been passionate about the idea of retail as a source of social mobility, but how can we get people who are excluded from taking part in the economy actually to be able to make the first step? And we got introduced to Joe and the team at Greyston, and were very inspired by what they were doing, and said, look, we want to do something really radical and introduce this into retail stores. Can you help us? And we partnered over a number of years and continue to partner on that journey. And so far, I believe it's going on for about 5,000 people who've previously been excluded from the workplace have had the opportunity because they have been able to make the first step into the workplace through open hiring at the Body Shop. And I think just one really important point to make on that, because it is a big step when you make a decision in a cosmetics store where you're delivering a service experience. There is a standard of performance that's required, right? So the key thing that the open hiring process does is remove the barrier to entry. But then once you're in, we make it very clear the standard of performance that has to be achieved, but then we make sure that we're providing the right level of support to really enable that person to be able to meet the standard. And sometimes, of course, you know, it gets to the stage where somebody can't make it, and then we respectfully separate. But at least that individual has had the opportunity of being back in the workplace for a number of weeks or months, and you know, has had a first step that's hopefully going to lead to another step somewhere else.
And it really fascinated me when I came across it, because you know, you would think of some of the in-store roles as being somewhat entry-level jobs typically, but actually in the case of the Body Shop, people working in store are having to talk about quite delicate ethical issues in an era of cancel culture, you know, at a time when people can take offense. So when, you know, a position, and these are not just always obvious positions. I mean, on extending the voting franchise to 16-year-olds, for example, it is plausible to legitimately have an argument against that. And so, you know, that making a success of open hiring for these roles that include, you know, having to talk to people about issues that I think any of us would want to do a bit of prep before being exposed on them is really quite significant. Alan, what's your question or comment?
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, Alan.
I enjoyed the conversation earlier about conscious capitalism. Over the years, watching the Body Shop when L'Oreal owned it, it used to drive me crazy because I felt that they had forgotten how to be a retailer. And then across the past few years, I've watched as actually, you know, the store environment has changed and the store staff have improved and so on. And I thought it was really interesting because, you know, being a retailer is how you make your money. And I wondered how you played that side of the equation, because, you know, the purpose conversation is great and it's really important, and it obviously links very closely to in a brand like the Body Shop. However, you've also got to sell product, and I was wondering how you went on that bit of the journey with the team.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and it was one of the biggest challenges because, you know, within the L'Oreal context, you can imagine it's such a huge organization. Somebody is doing well somewhere in the world. So if you're a brand that's slightly underperforming, slightly under the radar, it kind of doesn't matter because nobody's focusing on you. They're all thinking about, you know, Lancome in China, let's say. So there was an element of, you know, I'm just trying to think of the right word to use here that's not offensive to the very good people who were doing the right thing, but the way it showed up to the outside world. And I can't think of a word that really honors it correctly, so I'm not going to say it. But there was a sense of, we're here saving the world and the commercial guys are doing their thing over there, but we're here, you know, in our little office, dreaming great thoughts and effectively operating as an NGO. And I think what we said in the initial work that we did on purpose, we are not an NGO, right? You know, you can't be outside the core of the business. If you want to be doing things with a social environmental impact, it's got to be at the heart of our proposition. It can't be separate from it. And I think the kind of language that we developed over time was to say things like, you know, if you want to give 5,000 people who've been excluded from the workplace the dignity of paid work, sell a Body Shop product. If you want to take 100 million plastic bottles off the street of Bengaluru, sell a Body Shop product. You know, but it was that sort of sense of is the commercials that actually drive all the positive impacts that we have. But that's not intuitive to people. You know, people would prefer to be in an NGO type non-profit context. So you're right. It's a very good point and a challenge for a business like ours.
It feels like that could also be a challenge even for the consumer, in that, you know, the same person may want to change the world. They may also want good beauty, cosmetics, self-care products. But it's not necessarily self-evident always to them that those two things have to be, you know, through the same activity. And so I think there is a cognitive challenge with an offering such as the Body Shop. It's an extra thing. How do you really bake both sides of the fairer, more beautiful world together in such a way that, you know, that it really is obvious that they are aligned and one and the same thing? Speaking of alignment and one and the same thing, I'll go to Teresa, and then it looks like we have another question from Louise.
Thank you for such a fascinating conversation. Paul's question about the pandemic in Ukraine made me think about one other rather big seismic event that happened, and I wondered what impact Brexit had had on the business.
Yeah, Brexit, you know, it's had a number of effects on the business. And, you know, I was actually at Charles Tyrwhitt, plaintiff cry, the lapwing and all that stuff. When Brexit happened, I'd just come back from living in the US. And as I transitioned back, I think I was still living in a hotel when the vote happened. I was absolutely convinced that there was no way that Brexit could take place. And it did take place. And pretty much overnight, our cost of goods on shirts went up by about 35%. And the economics of the famous Charles Tyrwhitt 4 for 100, which had persisted for about 15 years, suddenly didn't make sense anymore. And all the consequences that came from that about, you know, a different kind of proposition, a different marketing model and all of that stuff. So some of that stuff had already happened prior to me getting involved in the Body Shop. But one of the early decisions I had to make as the decision in 2016 rolled through to the actual exiting of the EU was we had to build a distribution center in Germany to be able to serve our European markets. And that meant that we lost jobs in Littlehampton, which is an area of high unemployment, on the south coast of England, where we had our distribution for the whole world previously. And that became split across two centers. And all the complexity and cost and everything else that happened as a consequence of operating distribution centers in two different places and losing the economics of having one highly efficient center. So that was sort of one example. And then, of course, the cost of goods impact and the fluctuations of the pound and, you know, all of that stuff that we've all been experiencing has made life a bit more complicated than it might otherwise have been, let's say.
Yeah, Brexit. Yeah, I'm going to hold myself back from comment on that. But Louise, you have a further question.
Thank you. You made a passing reference to Patagonia earlier in comparison with how they've managed their business over the years. And I'm curious about the role of a brand like the Body Shop as an activist. Which increasingly Patagonia has adopted as a part of its identity, as an activist brand. I think the Body Shop's got that in it, but I'm also hearing that when you talk about purpose, there's got to be a commercial component to it. So the steps that you take, your purposeful actions, it's selling a product, you're running a business. And I'm curious, thinking about the future of the Body Shop, how much right do you think the brand has or need there is for it to operate as an activist?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and you know, something that I've wrestled with pretty much since the first day I arrived. Right, you know, just rewinding a little bit back to the earlier conversation about the thing about the Body Shop in the earliest days of Anita and Gordon, you know, probably up until the mid 1990s, was they were against the establishment. You know, whatever the establishment thought, the Body Shop represented the counterculture, and it was against that thing. And I think, you know, the complication today is, what are we against? You know, what is the establishment? Does anybody really know? Is it left or right, or, you know, somewhere in the middle? You know, it's not obvious. So that traditional path that the Body Shop took, particularly around some of its social impact programs, I think is a lot less obvious today than it was perhaps in the 80s, and particularly the 80s and to an extent the 90s. I think Patagonia is an interesting one because basically, if you like Patagonia, you love to be outside in nature. You want to be on, you know, beautiful mountains and beautiful valleys, fly fishing, doing whatever it is, mountain biking, whatever. And there's something about, you know, that there's a sort of natural focus of Patagonia is like, we're selling things to you so that you can enjoy the things that we love to do. There's an element of self-interest of the people who are behind. Yvon Chouinard obviously was famous as a mountaineer, and he wanted to preserve the mountains so that he could keep climbing in them, right? So not only, but that was certainly an initial motivation. I think the big difference there, obviously, it's a private company. They don't think about quarters, they don't think about years, but they do think about growth, and they do think about having a viable business that enables them to have an influence going forward. And I think many of us will remember that amazing advert that I think was in the New York Times. I was living in New York at the time that it was published. Don't buy this jacket on Black Friday. We just talked about Black Friday earlier. And of course, it was the biggest sales day that Patagonia had ever had in their history, despite the fact that they said, don't buy this jacket. We'd rather that you were out enjoying nature. So it's complicated. And I think the Body Shop, I think there is a legitimacy around, the commercial model, the triple bottom line model, which I'm so passionate about. The way we do business has a positive impact on society and a positive impact on the environment. I think that is clear. I think activism is in our soul, but I think figuring out what we're for and what we're against is tricky. And I think where L'Oreal ultimately ended up with is, let's just talk about animal testing, because that's an easy, safe one. And the thing about animal testing is, until very recently, with some of the new EU regulations, that was a battle that had already been won. So it always felt kind of irrelevant to keep talking about animal testing when it was a non-issue in the majority of countries in the world, particularly in Europe. So it's an interesting one. And if you have any, I mean, I'm not involved anymore, but if you have any thoughts or ideas, I'd love to hear, because it's one of the areas we really struggled with. And to Paul's point earlier, the campaign around Votes for 16, I mean, it's different in different parts of the world, but the idea is to say young people are very concerned about the environment and very concerned about society. Once they get to university, there's a lot of data that says they get a lot less interested and other things become more important. But there is a sort of sweet spot between about 14 and 18 where young people are really engaged by and worried about what's going on in the world and don't have any voice, don't have any way of expressing themselves, and can't shape policy. So there was a question to say, is there a way that we can enable younger voices to get heard around the table? And it might be Votes at 16, but it might also just be, youth fora where, people get involved in talking to senior leadership or politicians to be able to help try and shape the narrative. And of course, Greta is significantly younger than the voting age and has had, pretty seismic impact, I would suggest. So yeah, that was the sort of thinking about how you would say, let's make activism relevant for our customers and relevant in terms of the sense of purpose that we have. But I think it's a work in progress.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. What do you stand for in a world that's so complex and colliding crises?
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Many of us would be willing to give Greta our votes if if you were to ask for them. Devastatingly, we have to draw to a close. We always seek to land on time at MarketingKind, largely out of respect for the time of our guests. David, I asked you about how your leadership period at the Body Shop had changed you. I think I'm going to now have to work out how our conversation has changed me. It's been fantastic to accompany you on an adventure through all of the challenges that you've led so many thousands of people through. And I know I'm already looking forward to watching the recording, because I can already sense that there's even more brilliance that just came at me too quickly to absorb first time around. The question of brand activism and how marketing can play a role and brands can play a role in improving our collective quality of life is also a fascinating one. And I know that's of interest to Louise. And David, very kindly, you said you may be willing to get a little more involved in MarketingKind and strengthening what we do. So we'll very much look forward to that as well. A couple of things for people to be aware of. So our next gathering will be our Your Marketing Kind on November 28th with our own Richard Wayne, which will be on the topic of scripting our way to a better tomorrow. And in terms of our gatherings for the coming months, we already have gatherings planned with Solitaire Townsend, with the broadcaster and scientist Gaia Vince, with the broadcaster and social purpose officer Polly Mackenzie, with the environmentalist Jonathan Porritt, the entrepreneur and former Dragon's Den panelist Piers Linney, Ray Newton-Smith from the CBI, and the economics commentator Will Hutton. So keep an eye out for our newsletters and website as all of those dates come into focus. We also have an in-person event in London that we're planning for February or early March. If anyone is with us who is not yet a member of MarketingKind, you can find out more at marketingkind.org and become part of a community that sees the world's problems as marketing briefs in disguise. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you above all to David for sharing your leadership perspective with us this evening.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Paul. Very much enjoyed it.